Welcome to Better Without Billboards, a podcast from Ad-Free Cities all about outdoor advertising, why it's bad and what we can do to reclaim our public spaces. In today's episode, James takes a critical look at advertising regulation in the UK. Regulation is supposed to stop harmful or offensive ads from being aired, but we still regularly see harmful advertising on our streets, from vaping ads targeting kids to greenwashing fossil fuel ads. Why does regulation fail seemingly so often? And what are the alternatives? Let's join James in the studio to find out.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Better Without Billboards podcast. I'm James, and on today's episode we're going to be talking about what happens when ads go bad. So if an advert is offensive or misleading or greenwashes or anything like that, who do you call? The police? Your MP? Your gran? Well, as we'll hear, advertising in the UK is regulated by the Advertising Standards Authority, or ASA. And that's an acronym you're going to hear a lot on today's episode. And actually, I'd say we have in the UK a fairly strong system of ad regulation compared to many other countries. But that's not to say it isn't without its flaws. Part of the work we do here at Ad-Free Cities is to report rule-breaking ads to the ASA. And over the years, we've complained about ads from the likes of Shell, Total Energies, Toyota, 888 Casino, Shell again, Luton Airport, even the RSPCA. And we've had some big wins, like getting Shell's greenwashing energy ads banned in June 2023, or Toyota's Hilux adverts banned in November of the same year. On the one hand, this seems good, right? If offensive ads are being taken down following complaints, then that's a good thing. But on the other hand, if we have to keep complaining, does that not suggest that the system of regulation isn't actually working? If so many potentially harmful ads can slip through the net, maybe the net isn't up to scratch. So in this episode, we're going to take a look at the UK system of advertising regulation as enforced by the ASA. But we're also going to ask how this system is limited in what it can do. What are its strengths and weaknesses, and what are the alternatives? So to kick off, I spoke to my colleague at Ad-Free Cities, Veronica Wignall, and we're going to hear a bit of that conversation now. So I'm joined now by my colleague here at Ad-Free Cities, Veronica Wignall.
Hello.
Welcome to the podcast. Veronica is our in-house ASA guru, ASA expert, ASA nerd, whatever your preferred title is. Veronica, welcome to the show. Let's just start at the beginning here. So just give us an overview. What is the ASA? What does it do? How does it work? Go for it.
Sure. The Advertising Standards Authority is the UK's advertising watchdog. Mm-hmm. And its remit, like you said, is to tackle misleading, harmful or offensive advertising. There's a lot of advertising out there, and the ASA should be kind of getting a handle on the worst level of it. So it makes guidance for advertisers who should be making their adverts in line with the advertising codes you mentioned before, which are kind of codes of practice. It runs a copy advice service, so it talks to advertisers as they develop their adverts to make sure it's in line with those codes. And it also enforces the codes through rulings or investigations. So every Wednesday here at Ad-Free Cities, we're on tenterhooks as the ASA releases its rulings for the week. And some of those are pretty high profile. So one ad we were looking at earlier is one that used Madeleine McCann's disappearance to sell burgers. Another using the serial killer Fred West to advertise a Father's Day gifts. Things that adline can get pretty grotesque, and those were some that were actually banned. And then there's loads more where ads aren't banned, despite getting hundreds of complaints from people in the public, people in civil society, like the McDonald's ads, you might remember, that famously used a child's grief to sell a fillet of fish. And that one was withdrawn, but the ASA didn't take any action. So there's kind of different tiers of action that the ASA can take. But anyone can report an ad to the ASA, and they might launch an investigation into that ad, but that is quite a small percentage that are actually where there's actually any action taken.
Okay, so you said there anyone can make a complaint, right? Any member of the public, if you see an ad that offends you, you can just launch a complaint. And so what's the process then? How do you actually go about doing that? What does that look like?
Log on to the ASA's Make a Complaint page, and you fill out some basic details about who you are and then why you complain about the ad, why you think it's offensive or harmful. And then you probably won't hear from the ASA again. They might ban the ad down the line, they might undergo an investigation, but as a member of the public, you probably won't hear any more about that process. Like, that's not to say it's not really valuable to report an ad if you think it's harmful. If you're a civil society organisation and you're involved in engaging with the ASA, then you might get more kind of input into the process. So as Ad Free Cities, when we complain about an advert, if there is an investigation, we'll hear more about it, we'll have chances to submit more evidence, and there's like a little bit more dialogue that goes on.
Okay, brilliant. So, I mean, what actually is the ASA? Is it a government body? Where does it sit?
The ASA is a self-funded regulatory body. It's industry-led. It has various structures like an ASA council that's mostly made up of kind of industry bods. And it also, I think, has some kind of independent arbiter. If there's a ruling that doesn't go your way, you can kind of go to that independent process. But mostly, it's an industry-led body. It's not linked to the government, but it is. It has a memorandum of understanding with the Competition and Markets Authority, who also do some. Who have advertising in their remit, but they've essentially discharged most of that legal duty to monitor and regulate advertising to the Advertising Standards Authority, whilst the CMA does maintain some powers of their own and also can go into broader areas where the ASA can't actually. Like, the CMA can act on kind of online claims on a website, or marketing claims made on a label in a supermarket, whereas the ASA is restricted to kind of traditional forms of advertising like print, online, cinema, billboards.
Okay. So if I've understood it right, then, like, because I mean, there is consumer law in the UK, right? There's legislation on consumer law, advertising, and all the rest of it, and so it's effectively outsourced to the ASA. Is that kind of a summary?
That is my understanding. A lot of it is outsourced to the ASA. Yeah.
Okay. And they're ad industry led.
Mostly, yeah.
Okay. So
what does that
mean
getting
in
into
practice?
some of the difficulties around the ASA here, and one of them, is definitely that it is quite close. We released a report a while ago called "Too Close for Comfort," and when a lot of the industry, when a lot of the ASA's processes are kind of arbitrated by people who have worked or work in the industry, that is obviously problematic. It is a bit too close for comfort.
Okay. So let's dig into. Which,
by the way, the ASA would, I think, would challenge that. On independence. They would take a different understanding of how independent they are from the perspective of a campaign group trying to challenge advertising. It seems like there is far too much involvement of ad land personnel and resource in the ASA, but that is under discussion.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so we've started there digging into the issues with the ASA. So what else then, in your kind of experience dealing with the ASA, what would you say are the big problems?
I think it's worth saying that our critique of the ASA is not based on the efforts made by the ASA under the powers which they hold, right? So thinking about environmental issues as an example, the ASA has recently made a dedicated green team. They've undergone their own self-led investigations into things like airlines making claims about reducing single-use plastic, and therefore being environmentally friendly, and they've rightly challenged those themselves. So there is good work happening there. I think the problem, which you were kind of alluding to in your intro, is that the ASA's very function and the way it's set up is almost gonna fail. It's set up in a way that can't possibly sufficiently rein in the growing harms caused by advertising to society, to citizens themselves, and increasingly to the planet as well. We mentioned that the ASA is essentially self-funded and self-led, which is obviously a massive red flag. We can should we just unpack some of the other issues?
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. I guess let's think about timeliness to start with. If you see an advert in the street and you think that's pretty offensive, or it's massively greenwashing, there's a Shell advert talking about cleaner energy, and I know that Shell is expanding its fossil fuel operations. What can I do about it? Go to the ASA's page, make a complaint, and then perhaps 12 months later, that advert might be banned. By that time, it's been in the public realm for 6 months, maybe more. And the advertiser at that point sees no action. Not only is that advert not withdrawn and it's, we're exposed to it, not only as citizens, by the way, but also like policymakers, decision makers, civil servants. These are the kinds of people who are seeing those kind of ads. For example, for like airline expansion, whilst there's a key political decision being made about an airport expansion, if that airport's greenwashing at the time and the ASA bans the ads 7 months later, the damage has been done. So there's a real problem with how it acts sort of after the fact. That's a big problem. Then when it does act, firstly, that's only on a very small number of ads, like we've talked about. So thinking about environmental issues again, there were 503 ads complained about over environmental concerns in 2022. I'd be prepared to bet that that's a lot higher now, actually, even just 2 years later. In 2022, only 2.4% of those complaints were upheld.
Right.
So only 2.4% of those, that's 12 ads out of those 503 ads reported, were banned. And even a small percentage had any action at all. So there's a real problem with like the ASA's capacity, so think about the massive volume of adverts you see in daily life. That is under debate, and we have talked about this a lot. How many ads do you see in your everyday life? But it is a lot in your week. It's easily an awful lot. And then if only a few very small kind of flagship complaints are being upheld, it's just not enough to try and tackle some of the issues that we've been talking about. Then when the ASA does act, what can it do? Right? It can't fine. It has no legal teeth. All it can really do is say, we've warned the advertiser not to make these kind of ads in future. We've told them to take the ad down. Well, they took the ad down months ago, maybe years ago, and they don't have a fine, and this kind of gentle warning is just not enough of a deterrent. And we're seeing that repeatedly. So, for example, you mentioned that we reported some Shell ads for greenwashing and they were banned. Great. Well, that took a year. And then the next year, Shell's put out some ads which are basically very similar. And now they've been on LinkedIn, on TV, online, everywhere for about 3 or 4 months. And Shell obviously hasn't necessarily taken the ASA's warning on board. And now we have to sort of reinstate the whole process. So we've reported them to the ASA. The ASA has, after about 3 or 4 months, said that they will investigate the ads. And now we'll wait a few months for them to maybe be banned. And then what happens after that? Will the advertiser sort of sit on its heels for 6 months and then do the same thing again? It seems like this reputational deterrent isn't really working. We've seen the same thing with Repsol, a Spanish oil company who released an ad for hydrogen fuel cells with some like pretty autumn leaves and a car, and after being told that the ad was breaching the codes, they took it down. And then about 2 months later, they put basically the same advert out again. Apart from autumn leaves, it was a pretty droplet of water and basically the same text. So yeah, it seems like the sort of teeth that the ASA has is also insufficient, as well as things being untimely and a bit close to comfort.
And you're basically doing it on like a case-by-case basis rather than taking a systematic or systemic approach.
Yeah, well, it can't take a systemic approach, I suppose, because it's not there to make kind of political decisions or to act on categories. It can only find example cases and use those within this kind of remit of a deterrent approach. I guess. But I think the main problem with the Advertising Standards Authority is that it is fundamentally limited. And when you look at the impacts that advertising is causing, like we spoke about, like societally, and the way it shapes the lifestyles that we conduct, and the way it even shapes how we relate to each other, is a system of regulation enough when actually that advertising isn't doing us any good? It's not, advertising is promoting industries that we want to scale back drastically. It's kind of implicit in a lifestyle of like hyper consumption that is doing society and the planet no good at all, and is tinkering around the edges with saying this advert's slightly harmful, or this advert is a bit socially irresponsible. Is that working to address those harms? I think after having worked quite a lot with the advertising regulation system and finding it quite frustrating at times, I think like the conclusion is no, that isn't working as an approach, and we really need to think more radically about how we shape our society, perhaps without advertising as a force for what it is currently. And that's really difficult, right? It's a really big question. Think about where advertising is. It underpins our media, underpins lots of culture, actually. It underpins the internet, the online world.
The internet.
Yeah. I think we need to start having a conversation about that. You know, if there are harms being caused by advertising that cannot be addressed by a regulator that's insufficient, untimely, but also fundamentally limited, what are we going to do about that?
Okay. Yeah. So it's, advertising it's a political kind of like small p political force, but the regulator is set up in a kind of like bad apples approach.
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
yeah, exactly.
Can't deal with it.
Yeah. Think about an example. Let's think about gambling advertising. So we know that gambling destroys lives, right, and livelihoods. It's like, that's well known. It's also well known that advertising promotes gambling and can kind of instigate gambling addiction, and also that it's a real trigger for people who might have had a problem with gambling in the past. Yet the only way that the Advertising Standards Authority can act on gambling ads is to make sure that it's basically not overly linked to kind of like sexual success. That's kind of what they say. It's like, is this gambling advert linked to like sexual prowess? And if it is, then that's breaching the code. Is it targeted at under 18s? In that case, it's breaching the code. But how many under 18s go past a billboard for advertising every single day, right?
Right, yeah.
In public space, you can't avoid that.
You can't control for it.
And in the spooky dark world of advertising targeting online, pretty sure lots of under 18s are also seeing gambling ads, right? There's ways that it just can't work and should be stopped at source, essentially.
Okay, then following on from that, like, if the system we have doesn't work, what are the alternatives?
Just got to totally rethink the entirety of society, James.
Okay, thank you for listening to this episode of Better Without Billboards. No, so in terms of, if it's not a question of like bad apples, it's a question of advertising itself is the problem or is problematic, then like, yeah, regulation's not enough. So where do you go from there? You go up to legislation?
Always go up.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we talked about stopping something at source, right? So if we're thinking about the vast majority of advertising for products that we know to be extremely carbon intensive and bad for the environment, right? Like, we know we need to stop driving SUVs. We know we need to stop taking so many long haul flights. And there's a lot of climate policy around trying to reduce those things at the same time as there being a lot of advertising promoting and normalizing it. So we need to go to the source of that rather than looking at some bad apples or some greenwashing apples.
So that sounds good though. We can't say greenwashing apples. They sound tasty.
Yeah. I think we need to go up and think, how can we stop that volume of advertising for harmful products getting into the public realm in the first place? And there are obviously precedents for this. There was a long time where tobacco marketing was widely permitted and very common and employed a lot of the same tactics as carbon-intensive advertising does now, associating with health, associating with vitality. And eventually tobacco advertising was banned because of that reason, because it damages health and also because a lot of it was disinformation, mostly because of the health reason, obviously. And similarly now, there are growing calls to ban high carbon advertising, and some councils have taken that approach. And I imagine that's something you're talking about on this podcast in other episodes.
It will be, but for the sake of the listeners, I'm going to pretend to know nothing about this. What does that mean, Veronica?
Okay. There are municipalities not only in the UK but also in Australia, France, Switzerland and many other places where local councils have taken the initiative and decided if they're going to meet their climate pledges, then there's both a duty and a practical responsibility to stop adverts that promote the things that are going to hit those emissions or make their emissions really increase. So most recently and really excitingly, Edinburgh City Council in the UK, global capital city, banned adverts for airlines, airports, any content reasonably deemed to promote flying fossil fuel companies,
Wow.
SUVs, any fossil fuel powered car. And that is such
Incredible.
an exciting move. So that is on advertising spaces in the city that the council controls. So it's not
Okay.
all the billboards.
Sure.
It's still a really good step. It also includes some of their online spaces and hopefully sponsorship deals as well. So that kind of move taken by a city shows that there are alternatives to having damaging advertising, and you can see a whole category of ads and think that is harmful to the people I'm looking after, that's harmful to this society and the society we want to create, and therefore we'll remove it. You know, it just sounds logical to me.
Yeah, like it's kind of crazy how like that exists for tobacco and has done for quite a long time now. And I think you'd be very hard pressed to find someone who disagreed with that, who said no, tobacco should still be advertised.
Yeah.
Right? We all kind of just accept that.
But free speech, James.
Well, yeah, exactly. But like we all kind of accept that. But then when you propose it in these other areas, which are in many ways just as harmful, it suddenly sounds like really wacky and wild. And
But then does it? You know, I mean, it again, because I think if you said it's possible for your local council to restrict the amount of advertising that we're seeing for gambling, I think for most people that is a no-brainer. You know, that seems fine. It's obviously it comes down to councils having to make some financial decisions perhaps, but again, thinking about Edinburgh, there has been financial assessment of this kind of policy move, and it's been found that it actually isn't as drastic as all that, and the kind of long-term health savings are worth it. And think about air pollution as well, right? Like if you have lots of adverts which are leading to an uptick in sales for big diesel SUVs, and your air pollution in the city gets worse, what about all the resource your council is putting into trying to remove or reduce air pollution, right? It's like working at counterpoint, and it makes a lot of sense for councils to take this step, which compared to something like implementing a ULEZ is actually like less controversial, cheaper, efficient, logical. And then I think what we want to see ideally is a snowball of councils taking that step, and eventually a national policy change like the tobacco ad ban for industries which are equally harmful, like gambling, potentially like alcohol, unhealthy food and climate damaging products.
Wow, that'd be amazing. Yeah. So I guess in the meantime then, because that might take a little while, realistically, in the meantime,
Sadly, yes.
Are there things that the existing regulator, the ASA, could do to be better?
Oh, interesting. I mean, there are ways that the regulator could be reinforced and strengthened for sure. I think keeping in mind that category ad bans at a national level are needed, that the ASA can then enforce, right? That is the goal. Underneath that, perhaps there are ways that it could be made more independent from the industry it's monitoring. And quite a simple thing to do would be, or you know, like on paper, simple logical option would be to give the ASA the legal power to enforce a ban in a way that perhaps has both legal and financial teeth. So if Shell had been fined a significant amount of money for its last ad campaign, would it have released this new one that's equally as greenwashing? Perhaps it would be more of a deterrent as well as the reputational damage.
Rather than just a slap on the wrist.
Yeah. Another thing I think would be really useful is to suspend an advert pending investigation. I think the ASA can do that for something extremely harmful. But if there were, for example, ads by a very well-acknowledged polluter like Shell, like Barclays, like Toyota, that are raising questions, then suspending that advert pending investigation, I think, could stop some of that damage of the ad campaign kind of rolling on and everybody seeing it before there's any action. That's one other thing. I think I'll stick with those.
Well, fantastic. I mean, that's really given us a solid grounding in the ASA and its pros and cons. So thank you very much, Veronica, for joining us and for giving us your expertise.
Welcome. Thanks for having me.
So a really interesting conversation with Veronica there, all about the ASA and its strengths and weaknesses. And I suppose what stood out to me in that conversation was, you know, how Veronica was saying that the system of regulation fails because it favours the ad industry perhaps a little bit too much. It assumes that advertising is fundamentally fine so long as it as it were, follows the rules. Whereas perhaps what we're looking more at is a system that would recognize the inherent harm that advertising can do by its very presence. And this line of argument that if a product is harmful, like tobacco or junk food or gambling or even fossil fuels, then ads for that product are themselves promoting harm. And that's something that's perhaps missing from our current system of regulation. To understand this in a more concrete case, I thought it'd be interesting to look at gambling ads. Right? Gambling ads are interesting in this regard because there is legislation governing what can and can't be said in gambling ads, where they can and can't appear and so on. And there's also a lot of regulation around gambling ads. But does this go far enough? How does the legislation and the regulation complement each other? Is there tension there? And ultimately, what impact does this have on protecting people from the harm that gambling can cause? So to understand this a little bit more, I spoke to Will Prochaska from the Coalition to End Gambling Ads. And we're going to hear a bit of that conversation now. Hello, Will. Thank you for joining me on Better Without Billboards.
Very happy to be here, James. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. So, Will, we're trying in this episode to understand the sort of, I suppose, tension or the relationship between regulation of harmful advertising and legislation against harmful advertising. And, I wanted to chat to you because I think gambling's a really great example here because there is regulation and there is some legislation around gambling ads as well. And that filters through into regulation by the regulator, the ASA. So I just wanted to start by asking you, could you tell me a little bit about what that actually looks like in practice? Like what laws are there around gambling ads? What regulation is there? Could you tell me a little bit of some of the details?
Sure. So to be legally allowed to advertise gambling in Britain, you need to have a license with the Gambling Commission. And that license is governed by a piece of legislation called the Gambling Act 2005, which provides the Secretary of State the power to limit or restrict gambling ads in any way she sees fit. Very little has been done in terms of restriction, but the law is there. So there's a great opportunity to go further. Perhaps we'll come back to that later. For the time being, if you want to advertise, you need a license with the Gambling Commission, and within the license conditions are rules that you have to abide by the Committee on Advertising Practice standards governing gambling ads, which are enforced by the ASA. And some of those rules include things like you're not allowed to develop an ad which has a strong appeal to children. It's allowed to appeal to children, but it can't have a strong appeal to children. You can see where I'm going to go with this later, can't you? But you're not allowed to portray gambling as a way to make money. Right. Yeah. So there are some rules in terms of the content of the gambling ads, but there's almost nothing in terms of where they can be displayed, how they can be displayed, what media outlets are restricted. All of that is extremely liberal, effectively. So if you're a gambling operator and you've got a license, you can do an awful lot in terms of promoting your product, as long as you abide by the content rules. And that's one reason why we have something like £1.5 billion a year spent on gambling ads in the UK.
Wow. Okay. Yes. It's a big industry. So yeah, I mean, you've touched on it there already. Like there are significant loopholes, it sounds like. So perhaps you could tell me a little bit more about those. Like where does the regulation, where does that fall short in the case of gambling ads?
Sure. I mean, loopholes is probably the wrong word. There's sort of wide open doors really for operators to push. I mean, look. To start with, we need to remember that gambling products are really dangerous, right? I think we'll touch on this later, but we are talking about a set of products which are really dangerous to human beings, and if you use them, you're at a very high risk of harm. Okay, so the case that gambling ads should be restricted is based upon the products being harmful to human beings. And the fact that they are so liberally allowed to push these products at UK consumers isn't so much of a loophole as just a wide open door for the industry to do what it likes. And that's why gambling regulation, including advertising regulation around gambling, is often referred to as the Wild West, right? So things are going on in this space which don't happen in other sectors, right? Really frightening things. So it's not just the billboards on the high street or massive bombardment through social media or through sport. Can't watch a football game, for example, without being bombarded by something like 3,000 adverts through a 90-minute match, right? Frightening levels of quantity of gambling ads.
So, I mean, I guess my question would be, where has this come from? I mean, historically, how has this developed? Like, I mean, the gambling industry itself has always been around, but I feel that in the last sort of 2 decades has just exploded exponentially. And so what influence does that industry then have on the legislation and on the regulation and in making these, like you say, open doors, loopholes happen in the first place?
That's right. So really the gambling industry has increased in size since the 2005 Gambling Act, which came into force in 2007, which was a piece of legislation from the then Labour government designed to liberalise gambling in the UK. The idea being that the industry would be able to behave responsibly, and people would be able to be encouraged to gamble, but not into harmful gambling, if you will, and the government would be able to make an awful lot of tax revenue. What's actually happened has gone completely against those ambitions for the revenue. So you have an industry which is harming millions of people, which is taking money away from other more productive sectors of the economy. So it's actually bad for economic growth and it's bad for the inland revenue. So we're seeing reduced tax takes because of an increased gambling industry, increased scale of gambling industry. So that's where it's come from. Advertising is key to the industry's business model because unlike other products, right, if you have a kind of normal product, you would want to build customer loyalty over their lifetime and get them to keep coming back. The gambling industry doesn't work like that. The gambling industry, particularly the online industry, right? So online, if you exclude the National Lottery, 86% of the industry's profits come from just 5% of customers. And those customers are at very high risk of addiction, if not already addicted, right? So you've got a business model which is based on a mental health harm. And what happens to those customers is they get burned out effectively, right? So they either go bankrupt and have nothing left to gamble. Some people will be pushed towards crime to fund their gambling and will then be taken out of society. You've got a very high suicide rate associated with gambling. So up to something like 10% of suicides in England have a relationship to gambling. There's a range, but that would be the sort of top end of the range. All your customers manage to find help to stop gambling and they exclude themselves, right? So the industry needs to replace its customer base that it's churning through very rapidly. And that's one reason why they spend 1.5 billion a year on advertising. And as you say, the kind of loopholes, if you will, to allow them to continue, or the kind of open doors, if you will, are there. So where you see things like advertising towards children, they're not allowed to have a strong appeal to children, okay? The ads, the content of the ads. And the people who decide whether there's a strong appeal to children are advertising executives who work for the ASA, okay? So you've got advertising executives deciding what's best for our children to see or what not to see, which I find completely bonkers, right? This is a set of products which are really damaging to our health, and we need public health experts to decide whether or not an advert is safe or should be allowed, rather than an advertising executive.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, definitely. And I touched it earlier in my conversation with Veronica about the I suppose influence that the ad industry has on the ASA. I mean, ultimately the ASA is ad industry funded, right? So there's a bit of a conflict of interest if ever there was one there. So just picking up then, I mean, did I hear this right? You said 86% of the gambling industry's business comes from just 5% of customers.
That's the figure for the online sector, which is growing. The figure for the whole gambling industry is something like 60% from 5% who are classified as problem gamblers, to use the very stigmatizing terminology of the Gambling Commission and the sort of gambling establishment. So they measure people on something called the Problem Gambling Severity Index to decide how much they're harmed. And a large percentage of those 5% of customers that are really delivering such a large percentage of the revenue for the industry will be classified as problem gamblers, or will be at very high risk of becoming classified as problem gamblers. The industry also makes a disproportionate amount of its revenue from its most harmful products, which are the most addictive products, right? So modern gambling products, they're not like the old kind of traditional single bet on the horses or a weekly bet on the football. They've been designed to increase engagement and keep people gambling for longer and longer and longer to take as much money from them as possible. So they make a disproportionate revenue from those products. And I'm talking about things like online slot machines or even land-based slot machines, casino products, online casino products, which spin very rapidly and are very highly addictive.
So, in your view, then, what actually is the role of gambling advertising? Because we see, like in the case of fossil fuels, for instance, like fossil fuel companies don't advertise to sell to sell petrol, right? Because that's not how a driver thinks about, they pull into whatever petrol station is nearest or cheapest. They don't care if it's Shell or Exxon or whatever. So the purpose of fossil fuel advertising is not necessarily to sell the product, it's to sell like the social license, it's to sell the brand, it's to, make it seem acceptable. So is something similar going on with gambling then? Is it not necessarily about the product so much as it is about just appealing to a very small proportion of people, but then broadly just trying to generate social license? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think there's probably a number of purposes, and it depends on the type of advertising and the context it's in. So let's kind of look at a couple of examples. If you look at the Premier League, right, where a lot of people will be acutely aware of the amount of gambling advertising going on. Often in the Premier League, if you look on the side of the pitch whilst you're watching a football game, the ads are in Chinese. Okay, so why are the gambling ads in Chinese? Gambling in China, online gambling in China is illegal. Okay, so you've got a situation where Premier League clubs are advertising black market operators in a country that has outlawed online gambling. Wow. Those operators are sometimes based in Hong Kong or in the Philippines or elsewhere, right? So the Premier League is helping to circumvent regulations in another jurisdiction for gambling operators. And the reason for that will be, I mean, those operators would sort of have to speak for themselves. They're able to get licenses in the UK through something called a white label system, where the Gambling Commission allows UK licensed operators to effectively lend their license to a foreign operator so that they can advertise, and they'll pay them a fee for that. So it's a kind of murky world that enables this to happen, right? But I think those ads are to encourage online gambling in China and to alert people in China where they can go to find online gambling sites, should they wish to, even though it's against the law. The sort of bombardment that we see of gambling advertising for UK consumers of UK licensed operators will have multiple purposes. They often include things like free bets, which are incentives to gamble with a particular operator. So they are designed to get people to choose operators, and the operators accept, actually. So the operators claim that advertising doesn't increase the scale of the market, doesn't get people to gamble. All it does is it gives them choice between different providers of services, right? So these people would have gambled anyway, according to the gambling operators, right? This is one of their key lines. They're just giving people choice, right? And why wouldn't you want consumers to have choice when they've already decided to gamble? Mm-hmm. Now, this isn't true, of course. The purpose is, and Gambling Commission research has shown that gambling adverts are very effective at getting people to gamble for the first time. So they get them to start gambling, and they're very effective at getting people to gamble more once they have started gambling. And those two things are essential if you're going to create gambling harm. Okay. Mm-hmm. So one of the points here as well, which is at the core of the debate around gambling advertising, is that the last Conservative government and the Department of Culture, Media and Sport claim that there's no causal link between advertising and harm, which is a sort of, I mean, you need to do some mental acrobatics to believe such a thing, right? Mm-hmm. It almost denies the link between the consumption of gambling and gambling harm, which is a prerequisite, effectively. If you don't gamble, you're not going to get harmed by gambling directly. You can be harmed by somebody else's gambling, but you won't be harmed by gambling directly. So it's a sort of really surreal position, and it's why the industry make this case that actually their ads don't increase participation, they just give consumers choice. So a little bit unlike fossil fuel advertising, I do think the purpose of gambling advertising is to get people to start and to get them to gamble more, but it also has that effect of normalizing gambling, which makes it much harder for people like me to convince the government to reform it.
Mm. Yeah, it's quite hard to believe, like what you were just saying there, that the government won't accept that kind of causal link that gambling advertising leads to the harm. Because I mean, just a week before we're having this conversation, the government has announced, sweeping new plans to regulate and legislate against junk food advertising, because it's recognized that junk food advertising leads to more people consuming, high fat, salt, sugar foods, leads to obesity, heart disease, and all the other things. So it's, we're seeing increasingly that argument being made about fossil fuel advertising too. So now we've got this like kind of crazy system where some advertising is recognized as harmful and some advertising isn't, right? Junk food is, gambling isn't.
Yeah, it's wild. And I mean, this was a position of the last Conservative government. Labour, when they were in opposition, supported the government's white paper on gambling reform. So to what extent they believe every word of that white paper, which makes this statement that the evidence isn't strong enough to show a causal link, we will see. We've got a new gambling minister, so we're looking forward to seeing whether she's going to take a different approach on this. The ban on junk food advertising gives us real cause for optimism, because it now looks pretty outrageous if you're going to protect children from junk food, but you're not going to protect them from gambling. And we've got something like 100,000 children in this country who have got a gambling problem or at risk of developing one, right? Even though gambling is supposed to be illegal for them to participate in until the age of 18. So we've got a serious public health problem, particularly with children. And it would seem odd to stop junk food ads being targeted at children, but to allow gambling operators to continue to bombard them through sport and social media and any other medium they can find.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I suppose that leads on to a conversation about, where the future of this goes. So what is it that you at Sega would like to see? Are you supporting just a sort of total ban on gambling advertising, or is there some like nuance in there? What is it that you're advocating for?
So it's our position at the Coalition to End Gambling Ads that gambling can be a permitted activity without it needing to be promoted. And that's our firm belief. So there's enough evidence out there, more than enough evidence, and in fact, Britain's got more evidence perhaps than any other country globally, of the link between gambling products and harm. And when you've got such a set of products which are so clearly generating such a high risk to the population, there can be no reason why those should be promoted. And of course, when they are promoted, it is the nature of advertising to overplay the benefits of a product and not to mention the risks. And that's exactly what we see in gambling advertising, except the benefits of the product, the idea that you can win, for example, are far overplayed. Very few people win at gambling. That's not the business model. I think one of the CEOs of the big four gambling operators said 99% of their customers lose. That's the fact of it. So any advertising which suggests that you can win is pretty misleading, right? So these ads are inevitably going to overplay the benefits and downplay the risks, and we don't think there's any reason why gambling as a set of products should be allowed to be promoted. That doesn't mean that we want to ban all gambling, and it's one of the attacks of the industry that they set out that we're some sort of fanatics, if you will, who think that all gambling should be banned. That's not our position. We just simply think that it shouldn't be promoted, which is the case in lots of other very sensibly run countries around the world.
Yeah, and you've got a really nice sort of comparative table on your website that shows the different kind of regulatory regimes in different European countries, and it's kind of like ticks and crosses, different countries versus like the levels of regulation, and lots of countries have lots of regulation, and then the UK is at the bottom with just like nothing in any column along that whole table. So why do you think the UK is sort of falling so far behind its neighbours?
It's a really good question, and a tricky one to answer, I think, particularly because we do have more evidence. So there are far more academic studies on the link between gambling advertising and harm in the UK and related to the UK market than there are in, I think, most of those other countries in that table combined. So it is an oddity, and I think the answer kind of lies in a few places, really. I think we've got one of, if not the most liberalized gambling markets in the world. And as a result, the industry here is making astonishing levels of profit, and they're using that profit to lobby government extremely hard. So we saw in the past 2 years, something like £150,000 worth of hospitality targeted at MPs in the House of Commons from the gambling industry, taking them out to dinner or to concerts or whatever else it may be. There are large sums of money going into the main political parties on this issue as well. And that money works, right? Lobbying works, and it has effectively resisted regulations, which is why we ended up with a position from the Conservative government. I think it's one of the reasons why we ended up with a position from the Conservative government that there's no evidence of a causal link between advertising and harm, which is a kind of wild position to take, as we discussed. I think there's other reasons. It's not just the gambling industry, but the media industry in the UK is also very powerful. And the media industry has become, to some degree, dependent on gambling industry advertising revenue. So it's quite a high percentage of all ad revenue in the UK comes from the gambling industry. And they don't want to lose it. So they've ended up lobbying on behalf of the gambling industry, saying there's no evidence of a causal link. You mustn't clamp down on this because you'll hurt us, and we're going through a challenge anyway because of the move to social media. And so traditional media, broadcast media, for example, is really struggling. So you can't do anything that will harm us. And it's a very powerful sector in the UK. So I think that's another challenge that we come up against. And I think as well, we've been through 14 years of a Conservative government, which started to change at the end, which was really interesting, with their views on tobacco and their views on social media, looking a little bit more like they were interested in public health. But for the first 14 years, we were looking at a government which wanted to promote corporate power as a source of growth to their thinking, and didn't want to overregulate. And so I think that's another reason. And again, we come back to it. What will we see with the Labour government? I do think we're going to see a change of approach, and I feel quite optimistic in that area.
Okay, well, yeah, an optimistic note perhaps to end on there. We'll look to the future and see what happens. Yeah, I mean, like we've said, the junk food ad ban perhaps signals a change of direction that we might see. Yeah, finally make some inroads to the murky and dangerous world of gambling ads.
We can hope.
We can hope indeed. Will, it's been an eye-opening conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
A really eye-opening chat with Will there from the Coalition to End Gambling Ads. And some of the stats that he was throwing out, like how 60% of gambling revenue comes from just 5% of users, I found almost impossible to get my head around that. And it made me think of an argument that the ad industry likes to use about how adverts don't drive up consumption of a product or service, but instead just help people choose one provider or retailer over another. Well, clearly gambling ads don't work that way, right? So for one thing, someone experiencing so-called problem gambling behaviors might already be using all the available platforms to gamble rather than choosing one over another. And of course, when they can't gamble anymore, this machine spits them out and searches for a new target. The way Will described it sounded almost predatory. I was surprised as well to hear about how reluctant the government is to hear the argument that if gambling causes harm and ads promote gambling, then gambling itself causes harm. I mean, that seems perfectly logical to me, and a logic that we accept for tobacco ads and increasingly junk food ads. So why can't we accept it, or why can't the government accept it in the case of gambling ads? Now, I understand, of course, that gambling adverts are just one part of an overly liberal approach to gambling in the UK across the board. But reining in the reach of such ads would undoubtedly reduce harm. I think maybe my main takeaway of today's episode, and a summary of where we are at the moment in the fight against corporate advertising, is that we, by which I mean, Ad-Free Cities, Coalition to End Gambling Ads, and so on, people in the movement, clearly see how ads cause harm by driving demand for harmful products. But by contrast, many in government and industry, and even in the system of ad regulation, see advertising as fundamentally harmless, maybe even just a bit of fun, with no real power to influence behavior. But from gambling to junk food to fossil fuels and tobacco, the ad industry has always enjoyed a close relationship with harmful industries. As ever greater attention is paid to those industries and the harms they cause, how much longer can the advertisers stick to the line that they do no harm?
If you've enjoyed today's episode, then please subscribe, and if you can, please share this podcast with a friend or two. To find out more about Ad-Free Cities' work, head to adfreecities.org.uk or find us on Twitter and Instagram at AdFreeCities. Thanks for listening, and fuck adverts.